So in the last calculation, we went from miles per hour to meters per second. I would like to now look at how we can go and use the same type of calculation and apply it to an IV calculation. So when I first started teaching conversions of miles per hour or to kilometers or into meters per second, I always wondered why as a chemistry instructor, because half of my students were healthcare students. And I thought, if you go to Europe, your odometer is going to read in the proper units. Why do we need these conversions? You actually need them because it's the same exact style of conversion that you use for an IV calculation. So in an IV calculation, it'll say something like this. Infusion is set at 15 GTT per minute. That can throw you right there because you need to know that a GTT is the same thing as a drop. Some students will set up 1 drop equals 1 GTT, and they'll use it as a conversion. Others will just cross it off, that's what I tend to do, and call it a drop. And then we're going to calculate the flow rate of 1,500 milliliters of 5% dextrose infused over 12 hours. So as a chemist, again, I would always get hung up on the 5% dextrose. I would think, okay, how are they making this? But you don't need that when you're doing an IV calculation. It's just telling you that the patient's receiving 5%. It's a form of glucose, and it's so blood sugar. The drop factor, and this is a really common drop factor, and a lot of times you memorize them based on the IV being used, but this drop factor for this is 15 GTT per milliliter. And again, this means 15 GTT per 1 milliliter. So the reason that IV calculations can be considered difficult at first is they give you so many numbers. And when you have a lot of numbers, it's not a simple problem where you can just start and have one number and that's where you start. So with this one, and with the 98% of IV calculations, you're going to start with the milliliters. So this right here has a unit by itself. Usually I tell students to always find the unit that's by itself. In this case we have 2. We have the hours, we have the milliliter. Start with the milliliter. So 1,500 milliliters is going to be our starting point. And you use the drop factor to get rid of milliliters and put it into drops. So again, this slash is the same thing as a 1, even though they don't write it. So sometimes I write it as an equals 1. I'm going to put it down here, 1 milliliter, and it has to go with 15 GTT. Because again, this slash is the same thing as an equals. So now our milliliters have canceled out. And I'm going to put in parentheses here drops. So what we have is because GTT is the same thing as drops. Again, like I said, some students, rather than doing this, they will actually write out 1 GTT is 1 drop. And you can see the GTT cancel out, and you end up with drops. So we're almost there. Let's see what we get. 1,500 times 15. .25 times 10 to the 4th drops. So we're almost done. But with drop rate, they want to know over how many minutes. So a lot of times you'll notice that your answers, if they're multiple choice, are written in drops per minute. So we have 12 hours. So our next goal will be to convert this into minutes. So 12 hours. We just did this in the conversion where we went from miles per hour. So we're going to put 1 hour on the bottom, 60 minutes. The only difference is in IV calculations, they usually do it per minute. They don't do it per second. So we're done once we've converted this into minutes. So we'll take the 12 times the 60. And we get 7.2 times 10 to the 2, or 720 minutes. Divide them out, just like we did with the miles per hour when we went into meters per second. We had to divide it out. So with the IV calculation, that is the one thing that can make them a little tricky, is you're converting 2 different units, and then in the end you have to remember to do the final division. So 2.25 times 10 to the 4th divided by, and I put these in parentheses when I put them in my calculator so that it doesn't do anything weird. And then I get 31 because they usually write it as a whole number. So my drip rate is going to be 31, and my unit on top is drops. Just bringing this down here, and I divided it by minutes, so that's drops per minute, which is the most common units for your IV calculation. Notice how similar the setup was for miles per hour.